Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending our Global Issue Speaker Series on Mexican film and contemporary social issues. As many of you no doubt are aware, film, both documentary and non-documentary, has been used to examine social issues around societies around the world. And we're fortunate enough tonight to have our presenter, adjunct professor of humanities, Jean Lauer, to walk us through Mexican film and how it's been used to examine social issues in that country. So I'd like to welcome, and please join me, Dr. Lauer.
Thank you. Thanks. So how's my volume? Good? Okay. I really appreciate you being here. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I was really happy to be invited to be one of the speakers this year. Thank you very much. I am obviously, well, maybe not obviously, I'm not Mexican, I'm not Latina. And I start out with that because I think it's important, and one of the things that I work with all the time with my research and my teaching is social and historical context, right? Like, where do we come from and how does that shape our experience? And then how do we interpret other people and their experiences through that lens? So I start with that. I have this slide up. I'm going to actually switch to the next slide here. This is one of my favorite images from the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. I highly recommend if you get to go there. So I just open with that, and one of the quotes attributed to Porfirio Diaz: "For Mexico, right, so far from God and so close to the United States." And this is a phrase that has been used throughout the decades to explain a lot of different perspectives from the Mexican, right, side of the border. So a lot of times, because we live here, we live in the U.S., we live in Texas, which is now for over 150 years, right, the U.S. and not Mexico anymore. And our understanding and relationship to Mexico may be based on having lived there and come to the United States, or it may be entirely based from not ever having been in Mexico. But whatever that is, right, we live very close. We here in the United States live very close to Mexico. And the United States has a particularly long relationship, right, fraught with all sorts of good and bad that defines our relationships. And I decided to focus on Mexican film because it's one of my favorite things, and contemporary social issues, because we live in a time when immigration, and Mexican immigration in particular, is in the national spotlight consistently, even more so in the past few months, I would say. And we don't often take the time, I don't think, to consider the conversation from the other side of the border, which is not, even though I have this quote up here, so close to the United States, not always obsessed, right, with the United States. Mexico is interested in Mexico and all the things that affect it, whether that be the United States or other issues as well. And both of these, I mean, Mexican film, Mexican contemporary social issues, right? I could teach classes in it, semester after semester, and not cover it all. So today is just a few different conversations, maybe, and I hope at the end you guys can add to some of these conversations with your perspectives and questions. But these are the ones that I've observed that are pretty salient in today's contemporary Mexican society. And yeah, and I'm going to let the films do a lot of the talking. I'm talking now, but we're going to jump into some of the clips very soon. But before we do, I do want to remember, right, that not just now, I'm not picking on now, although now is important. For a very long time, okay, there has been a narrative about the U.S. and its border. So when I say a view from the north, I'm like looking down from the U.S., right, that we, whatever that is constituted as, are being invaded. We must defend ourselves, right? And they, and you know, my in quote marks, from the generation that loves this, sorry. They are the illegitimate, and I use illegitimate here because it covers a lot of the senses of the word, but the most important thing is that there's a sense of being invaded that is, right, in the public discourse about our relationship, not only with Mexico, right, but with everything that comes through Mexico to get to the United States. So this is a particularly dominant discourse, even from people, even from well-intentioned people who want to talk about Mexico, right? These types of metaphors and images still pop up. That's a movement of people. And I was like, well, you know, Mexico's like, what are you talking about? Okay, how can you think that you are that important, right? That all we think about is invading, in every sense of the word, right? The United States. So this is my way of just getting started, flipping the conversation, and we're going to start thinking about some of the topics that are important to Mexico from Mexico's side of the border. As I mentioned, social, historical, socio-historical contexts, they matter. We can't shake them. At least I don't think we can. I'm a strong proponent of cognitive psychology. We're shaped by our experiences. It informs our knowledge base, and how we interpret the world comes through that experience. And media and the use of images and language matters, okay? It shapes how we interpret the world and how we act in it, what we think is true and what we think is false. Now, there's often these polls, and I use the term brown tide rising. I will come back to brown tide rising. It's a term that the professor Otto Santa Anna used, and he published a book in 2002 that I was flipping through a few months ago, and I was like, this is so relevant still today. So relevant still today. That the image, right, as I said before, like the we're being invaded, the brown tide rising, it was actually from Prop 187, I believe, in California, from a bill, legislation. We're being invaded, brown tide rising. We need to do something about it, right? Defend ourselves. Now, one of the counters to that, right, and I am going to argue that we need to counter this perception. It needs to be much more nuanced than an us versus them relationship. I don't think that the counter of they, as in Mexico, if we humanize, right, this conversation, whatever form that takes, I don't think that the way to go is to say, let's just start with they're just like us. And the reason that I say that is because even within the United States, right, even when we say we in the United States, if we're talking about a self-national identity, there's a lot of difference, right? There's a lot of difference. I'm from Michigan, okay, grew up in Michigan, lived in Arizona for 7 years. I don't recommend the Phoenix metro area, by the way, just a personal thing. But I love living in Austin, and I've been here a while. Okay, all three of those experiences are quite different, and they're all in the United States. So even within our own country, we recognize difference, right? Well, if we think about the colonial past of the United States, right? And we think about the colonial past of Mexico, there are overlaps, of course. But the result has been two countries, right, with very different social and historical contexts that have led to the present, okay? So when we say they're just like us, I understand that. It's very well intentioned. And of course, we're all humans on this planet, and I do believe that we are all equal. But Mexican, right, identity and national formation is quite different from the United States. The laws that people live under, right, the social organizations, even the religious practices have developed differently and aren't uniform even within Mexico, of course. So my point is, let's just complicate this, right? Let's get out of we, let's get out of they, and let's just take some time to consider some of the social and historical contexts that shape where Mexico is today, and how filmmakers working in Mexico and artists working in Mexico and people in Mexico are talking about themselves and their experiences. And just start there. So I thought for a really, really long time, what clip do I start with? Now, I'm going to start with a clip from Ayotzinapa. And you can see the subtitle is Chronicle of a State Crime. I'm going to mention ahead of time, this is the one clip that does not have English subtitles, but you will get the meaning even if you don't speak Spanish. It's going to start with a protest. And it's going to, in the middle, it's going to tell us some of the names of people who are disappeared, 43 people presumed dead. And you'll get the idea, I promise. Now, the reason that I was like, do I start with this or don't I start with this? You will see very, very quickly, I think. So I'm just going to go ahead and play it and make some comments after.
No queremos que nuestros hijos sigan siendo amenazados por estudiar en normales públicas, por estudiar en normales donde son asignadas para la gente pobre. El único delito de nuestros jóvenes, nuestros hijos, es ir a una escuela pública.
Bernardo Flores Alcaraz.
Benjamín Asensio Bautista.
Carlos Iván Ramírez Villarreal, 20 años.
Saúl Bruno García.
Jorge Luis González Parral, 21 años.
José Eduardo Bartol Datempa, 19 años.
Alexander Mora Venancio, 21 años.
Israel Jacinto Lugardo, 19 años.
Abel García Hernández, 21 años.
Antonio Santana Maestro.
Jonás Trujillo González, 20 años.
Emiliano Alén Gaspar de la Cruz, 23 años.
Everardo Rodríguez Bello, 21 años.
Felipe Arnulfo Rosas, 20 años.
Cuthberto Ortiz Ramos, 22 años.
Magdaleno Rubén Lauro Villegas, 19 años.
Dorian González Parral, 19 años.
Giovanni Galíndez Guerrero, 20 años.
¡Vivos se los llevaron! ¡Vivos los queremos!
Okay. So this is a documentary, and it chronicles the disappearance of a number of students from a school in Guerrero. The crime, the state crime, it's very complicated, and I'm not here to explain it because it still hasn't been explained, and that's part of the story of this documentary. Over 100 students went missing. Many of them are still missing, the 43. And the reason, the reason that I was like, do I start with this? And I think it's important to start with this, which is why I chose it, is because some of the dominant narratives, right, about Mexico are criminals, right? Drug dealers, violent, and not very good people, okay? What this documentary does is say, yeah, there's corruption in Mexico, and these are the people that are suffering, and here is what has happened to them. And here are the answers we want, okay? So when we look at films from Mexico, I think we would do a disservice to only look at the happy ones, right? I start with this. It's one of the darkest ones in the group on purpose. Because what I don't want to say here today is that there aren't horrible things happening in Mexico. There are horrible things happening in Mexico every single day. But I also recognize, let's flip this again, right? There are horrible things happening here every day in this country. So when we are talking about violence, when we're talking about state crimes, right? We need to recognize that they happen everywhere. So how are they happening? And why are they happening? And to whom, right? That is what film and media can help us to understand. Now, the disappearance happened in September of 2014. And you saw the clip of the demonstration. Ooh, just got a little louder, sorry. You saw a clip of the demonstration that took place on October 8th. There were many, many demonstrations and many efforts from the president of Mexico down to cover up what happened. The official version is, by all forensic accounts, not the accurate version. And like I said, there is currently no good answer for anybody. But the people have found, right, there's a collective that put this together. The director, Javier Robles, if anyone is familiar with the film Red Dawn, Rojo Amanecer, not the US version, but the Mexican version, he was also involved with that. And that film was about the massacre in Tlatelolco in 1968 of students, okay, who were also protesting. So there's a history, this recalls the history in Mexico, both of the ability, right, of people to organize, go to the streets, right, but also of government repression and censorship of information, right, from the government to the people. The other thing that this documentary does is explain some of the relationships, right, and dependency of the Mexican people on the drug trade. Guerrero is a huge poppy-producing state in Mexico. And many of the people who live there are dependent on US consumption of illicit drugs for their livelihood, okay? So again, looking at it from Mexico's viewpoint, right? Many poor people have an opportunity to work, and they do, okay? And then they live in this situation where the government may or may not help you, right, in certain circumstances. And one of the other, just before I move to the next thing, we're going to look quite a bit at indigenous people's issues in Mexico. We have to, right? Unlike the United States, where most of the dominant discourse has really pushed our American Indian tribes right to the side, and they're not, except in a few circumstances, considered part of the national fabric. In Mexico, right, the indigenous communities are a part of the national fabric in their own way, okay? Different, like I said, from the United States. So one of the things that also is explored in this is the ability of the indigenous peoples through community police to take care of themselves and to execute justice versus the state police. Because really, ultimately, the criminals in this documentary are the state police. So it's a conversation that is continuing, and it's an important one to have. And I don't think, as I mentioned before, I don't think the United States is completely innocent here, but we're not listening from this side, I would say. So this is the first example of Mexican, I would say, expose of how things work or don't work in Mexico. I'm going to switch to a narrative. It's also got a difficult subject matter. La Jaula de Oro, they've translated as the Golden Dream. I think it's also a little more nuanced. We might say the Gilded Cage. That is something that you dream about, but it's also a trap in some sense. Not, like it's a trap, but that it can enclose you and limit you in your experience as well. But when we're talking about the Golden Dream, we can think about it, right, as the U.S., right? Again, the narrative of invasion is going to get flipped, okay? And we are going to look for just a few minutes at it from another side of the story. And I'll talk a little more about it. This is from a few years ago, 2013.
Patik Daniel!
A ver, levántate.
Las calvos y Batik Daniel.
A ver. ¿Este niño viene con ustedes?
No.
¿Sí o no?
No. Sí, es guatemalteco.
¿Y ustedes de dónde son?
Sueños de oro.
¿Eso dónde queda?
Por ahí cerca.
A ver, denme los documentos.
Lo cargamos.
Ah, ya valió madre. Esa pared.
Órale.
Órale, cabrón.
A la pared, a la pared.
Órale, cabrón.
Póngase ahí en la pared.
Ahí. A ver. A ver las patas. Mira. Están chingonas las botas, ¿eh?
Están chingonas.
Ey. Siéntate.
Tú también.
Siéntate. Sácate las botas. Sácate las botas.
Órale.
Muchan mini mo ko isa lahat yun.
Sí.
Yan?
Sí.
Sácate esa maleta. Suéltalas. Sueños de oro.
¿Iban a hacerse ricos en los Estados Unidos? Pues ya no llegaron.
Vámonos. Tú también. Órale. ¿Qué estás? Suelo. Ponte ahí. Agárramelo.
Ajá. Se lo vas a decir a tu pinche madre, cabrón.
Vámonos. Vámonos.
Allá.
Okay. So, did you notice that they end up in Guatemala? On the sign on the wall? They've just been returned to Guatemala. The story behind them going to Mexico and coming back, the only one of that group that is Mexican is the kid from Chiapas who doesn't speak Spanish. Okay, the rest of them are all from Guatemala, and they try, when the police show up, right, they try to flip the narrative and say, no, we're from Mexico, he's from Guatemala, which is pretty cruel, right? It's something that kids do, though. So, but just so you're clear, the three youth that were speaking Spanish were from Guatemala, and they met Chauc on their way through Mexico when they finally get from Guatemala to Mexico. So this movie actually follows their journey. This is near the beginning of the film, and Samuel, one of the boys from Guatemala, decides not to try again. And we don't really get a story of the why they're leaving, okay? I find this a very interesting film for that reason, that it's not about the why they're leaving. It's about the process of the journey and what these kids go through to try to get to the United States. And that's what we experience with them. So one of the things we experience is them riding on the train. La Bestia is what many of the trains are called that take people from the north, or from the south to the north, I should say. And they ride those along with other people. Their journey does not go terribly well. I don't want to spoil anything about it. But all of the layers to it that show, I mean, they're really kids. And one of those kids is actually a girl in disguise. So one of the things that you learn by watching this film, right, is what kids are going through to try to get to the end. And they're unaccompanied minors. There's no adults that are helping them along the way. They're taking care of themselves. But it's worth it. For whatever reason, right, for the ones who return, it's worth it for them to get there. And I think not having the why doesn't allow us to question the why, right? When we're watching it, it's just given that it really is the most necessary thing for them to do, is to get to the United States. And through it we see, right, the relationship between the Guatemalans, right, and the native Mexican who happens to be from Chiapas, and that relationship actually does develop, as you might expect, kids, you know, looking out for each other along the way. This film actually was quite popular, not like a box office smash, but in terms of like national Mexican cinema on the screen, this film was one of the top films seen through the National Cinematheque, the Cineteca Nacional in Mexico City. They do a tour of films every year, and this is one of the most popular that toured with that. And it was also a film that was seen outside of the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about how films circulate when we get to the end. But this is a film that, if you're in the art cinema world, like if you go to film festivals, this would have been on your radar. But it's not like none of these are going to be box office films. These are films, you know, from the art cinema or from the working documentarian sector of the population. Okay. So this next one is also a road movie, and it also explores some of the relationships between class in Mexico. It's also also a narrative. A Separate Wind, Viento Parte. It's from a few years ago as well, a couple years ago. So you're going to see another clip along the way. I will set this one up a little bit more. Sometimes I like you guys to experience, and sometimes I think it's helpful to set it up. So here we are. We have two young kids again. Their mom has suffered a stroke, and they are finding their way to their relative's house. I can't remember if it was a grandma or an aunt, but they're on their way to a relative's home, and they are also left to their own devices to make it to their relatives. And along the way,
¿A poco aquí también mataron a alguien?
Es el tequio.
¿Qué es tequio?
Es el trabajo que uno hace para la comunidad. Esa fuerza. Badiu, Shivishe, Nayas, Nulula, Oko. Chise, Shatul.
Mayakari, Luchedo, Chinesa.
Tarisi, Chisa, Dulu, Gigilagua, Huapan. Necayudi.
La Palatucheca. Pichiga.
Nagaidu yakanu. Tikaru tiritujidi. Adiushi.
¿Qué idioma hablas?
Zapoteco.
¿Y cómo se dice carretera en zapoteco?
Nesa.
¿Y coche?
Gibarushoñi.
¿Estuviste en Estados Unidos? ¿Cruzaste el desierto?
Fui en avión.
¿En avión?
Pues en avión vas como turista. Nomás que te quedas y no vuelves.
¿Por qué te regresaste?
Estaba en una fiesta. Y me fui por más cerveza al 7-Eleven. Y me agarró la policía en la puerta del 7-Eleven. Todavía han de estar esperando que llegue con la cerveza a la fiesta. ¿Les gustan las hamburguesas?
Sí, ¿hay aquí?
No, no hay. No como las de allá.
¿A ti te gustan?
Ajá. Eso y el barbecue es lo único bueno que tienen los gringos. ¿Les gusta la salsa barbecue?
Hay aquí, sabe a plástico.
Plástico con caca del 7-Eleven.
¿Por qué nos paramos aquí?
No sé, igual iba al baño.
De lo del viaje van a ser 800.
Ya habíamos quedado en 400.
Es que es bien lejos.
Pero no me va a alcanzar para el resto del viaje. Ya habíamos quedado en un precio.
Hasta aquí son 400.
Que solo me quedan 400 de lo que saqué en Río Grande.
Pues allí en Guajuapan no hay cajero de banco.
No seas ladrón, no nos puedes hacer esto.
Es lo que vale.
Pues no te voy a dar nada.
No me des nada. Pero aquí se bajan.
¿Cómo se dice por favor en zapoteco?
Canábali.
So here we have Omar and Karina. They're the kids in the truck. And we have Ezequiel, who, for an agreed upon price, at the beginning, we don't see this part in this clip, but right before this, the kids basically are like, we have $400 and this is, or 400 pesos, sorry, and this is where we need to go. And he finally agrees to. But as the journey goes on, and they're essentially, right, they're making fun of him in their way. They don't realize necessarily their tone, right? But it's a class distinction that's being pointed out, right? A difference that they don't recognize, that they don't understand, that they're not aware of. But there's a social distinction, right, between their knowing Spanish and being from the city, and him being from a place that they don't understand, speaking a language that they don't understand, and they feel, right, entitled to essentially make fun of it. And as it goes along and he says, you know what, no more, $400 gets you this far, right? He sets that line that says, that's as far as I will be used to by you. And it stands in for that class relationship. It's more than just that, right? That one interaction. This would be something that he has obviously experienced throughout his life, right? And he's been in the United States and he's come back and he has a perspective on things that are quite different from them. And this is something that you see in many films in Mexico, this relationship of trying to negotiate social relationships, trying to understand, right, the differences between regions, and even, right, these intercultural differences that happen between classes and people from different states. Another thing, you know, I love that it's just natural, right? It's presented as natural that someone would work for a while in the United States and then return. And this is the case for many people in Mexico, whether they return because they're caught at 7-Eleven or they return of their own volition. The flow is both ways. And in fact, I don't know if anyone else caught it, but yesterday on NPR, which is a phrase I say all the time, but yesterday on NPR, on the Texas Standard, Joey Diaz was actually talking about this immigration flow and how we're basically at net zero with Mexico, with people, you know, coming in and people going out. But, right, the perception is quite distinct from that, in our media at least. So this is that clip. Okay, we're gonna switch a little bit of gears, and we're gonna go from a narrative with largely male-centric. We had Karina, but she's there on the side more than anything. And we're going to go to a film that is actually largely about women and by women, and about family and what it means to belong to a family. And I'm going to just set this up here like that and talk a little bit more about it after. This is from 2013, and again, this is also a narrative film. The Amazing Catfish, Los Insólitos Peces Gato.
Así las tenía yo antes, ¿eh?
¿Ah, sí? Sí. Ahora resulta que las tenías como yo, ma.
Ah, pues ¿de dónde crees que las sacaste?
Wendy, deja de tocarte, la gente nos está viendo. ¿Qué, a ti te compleja tu cuerpo, anoréxica?
Oye.
¿Qué?
Claudia, ¿me pasa a Timothy?
Oigan, me dejaron una más grande que la otra.
Ay, lo digo.
¿Qué? ¿Qué? ¿Qué pasa?
Armando, no te muevas.
A ver, Armando, ven.
No te muevas, Armando.
¿Le picó? No sé.
Mamá, ven, mira, hija. le eché agua?
Espérame. Échale.
Chiquito.
¿Te está doliendo? ¿Te sigue doliendo? Ya. Ya, chiquito, ya.
Oye, no es tan duro. Mira, es decir.
Mariana, pásame el repelente.
Ve tú por él.
¿Quién seguirá, Mariana? Solo faltas tú en este viaje maldito.
Cállate.
Deja ver.
Un vidrio. Ay, ay, ay.
A ver.
Hijo de eso.
¡Ay, tu cara, güey!
Ya.
A ver, ya.
Ya.
Ay, pobrecito.
¿Saben qué? Mejor ya vámonos. Empiecen a levantar todos, ¿sí?
¿Te ayudo?
No. Niños. Mariana, recoge tus cosas, por favor.
¿Qué te dije? ¿De qué? Pareces panda. ¡Ay, no! ¡Mamá! ¡Mamá, qué tengo!
Te hiciste una antifa.
¡Ay, no!
So, this is one of those ones where not everything is about the United States, right? This is a family at the beach enjoying a day. The young woman who's kind of by herself at the end is actually not part of the biological family, but has been adopted throughout the film by actually the mom of the family. And you probably noticed that that Martha, who's the mom's character, Martha, she looks sick, right? I don't know if you noticed, but she's very, very skinny. And I didn't want to point it out at first because I wanted you to just kind of see it. But she is actually dying of HIV/AIDS in the film. And she meets Claudia, the young woman who's not a part of the family but becomes a part of the family, in the hospital when they're both in there for, Claudia's in there for appendicitis and Martha's in there because she's not feeling well. And Claudia just doesn't have a family. She's disconnected. She works, you know, it's kind of, there's some really funny scenes of her very boring kind of supermarket job at the holidays too, but it's not funny that she's alone. And this family takes her in. And in this scene you just watched, if you caught, like throughout the trip at the beach, right, like each of the kids, like one gets stung by a bee and one steps on glass, and the mom is taking care of them throughout. Just after this scene, Martha falls ill again. I mean, she's very close to dying, actually, spoiler. But the film is about her death, and you know that pretty early in. And Claudia ends up kind of taking on that role of older sister, right? Someone who can be there for the kids as their mom is going through this really tough time, and they're going through this really tough time. Now, one of the things that you may know and you may not know, but Mexico has a serious HIV/AIDS problem. And like many places in the world that isn't treating it as well as they should be, it is growing. And one of the things that has happened in Mexican society throughout the years is that many men have homosocial and homosexual relationships. Whether they're bisexual or gay or not, it is something that many engage in, and many have made their wives ill. And this is actually based off of a family that Claudia Sanluz met. And so there's some, elements of biography, but there's also just a recognition of this social reality that women get sick from their husbands don't stay, and they're left, right, both with their illness and with trying to decide what to, how to pass things on to their family. So this explores an issue, right, that we may or may not be aware of in the States, but is one that is lived by many people around the world, not just in Mexico, but also in Mexico for those social reasons. And well, we'll get to the stigma and the homosexuality instances in just a moment, but I love that it shows us this without beating us over the head. It really doesn't beat us over the head with any message other than real people living real lives in hard circumstances are making the best of it that they can. Okay. Yeah, so now we're going to get to Blatangelis. This word is a combination, the title of the film is a combination of the Latin for cockroach, which I guess is blata, I learned this from this film, and the Angelus, one of the important hymns in the Roman Catholic faith, and it is put together to signify that the lowest of the low, right, the cockroach, the thing that you squish or look down on, right, is just as worthy of elevation as anything. And so that is where that root comes from. This is a documentary, and I'm going to let the people in it speak for themselves and then talk a little bit after.
El primer año es muy difícil porque es de conocimiento y adecuación, y el segundo también. Y el tercero, y el cuarto, y el quinto, y pues hasta ahorita Rodolfo y yo vamos en el 29 y seguimos conociendo y ajustando.
La mayoría venimos buscando algo que no tenemos, a lo mejor en nuestra casa, algo que no tenemos en los antros, algo que no tenemos en los lugares de ligue, que es ver a las personas desde otro punto de vista y que me vean a mí.
Hermanas y hermanos, estos son los dones de Dios para nosotros que somos su pueblo. Acérquense a alimentarse con ellos, recordando que en la Iglesia de la Reconciliación tenemos consagración y comunión abierta. Es decir, no hay que cubrir ningún prerequisito para poderla recibir. Es simple y sencillamente la presencia de Jesús que viene hasta la orilla de tus miedos, de tus prejuicios, de tus angustias, para invitarte a que des un paso más allá y recibas su presencia. Jesús es sanador y viene a sanar tus heridas, no a premiar nada, ni a castigar, sino a sanar.
En la medida que un ser humano, un hombre o una mujer, asume su condición plena de ser humano pensante, de ser humano sexuado, de ser humano en libertad, en ese momento se desprende de la religión dogmática.
No, la Iglesia no se pronuncia en una definición tal de la homosexualidad, sino la Iglesia lo que hace, la única condena que hace es el acto, así como lo hace en el acto heterosexual fuera del matrimonio. Lo hace para uno y para el otro, es el acto de la utilización del cuerpo humano como un simple objeto sexual. Eso la Iglesia lo condena.
Pues no inventes, no me engañes. Nosotros amamos a los teólogos mientras no hagan teología. Nosotros amamos a los futbolistas mientras no jueguen fútbol. Nosotros amamos a los zurdos mientras escriban con la derecha. Bueno, cuando hablamos de la Iglesia Católica Apostólica y Romana en México, como seguramente en muchas partes del mundo, quizá pudiéramos hablar de un gran abanico de posibilidades. Lo que normalmente se conoce es la jerarquía, que es la que habla, la que tiene las cámaras, la que tiene los medios, la que sale sus declaraciones publicadas en los periódicos, pero no alcanzamos a ver la labor que quizá algunos pastores, algunos ministros, sacerdotes de pueblito o de algún lugar están haciendo. Y lamentablemente no es la dominante. La dominante es más una postura de jerarquía, de abrogarse la verdad absoluta, de abrogarse la posesión divina, de solo con nosotros Dios está, de negar la validez de los bautizos celebrados por otras iglesias, incluso cristianas, y una labor muy burocrática.
Lo que la Iglesia busca es que el cuerpo humano, templo del Espíritu Santo, como dice San Pablo, no sea ese cuerpo humano únicamente un sentido o un deber de la sexualidad, sino que siempre tiene que estar abierto al amor y a la reproducción.
Lo importante es que minoría o no deja de ser una hipocresía. tanto los sacerdotes que no siguen el celibato y que mientras sea con discreción tienen sus hijos y sus mujeres, como los sacerdotes que igual mientras sea con discreción tienen sus amantes varones y mientras la población no se entere no hay problema. Sigue siendo una hipocresía y una hipocresía jamás es una expresión de honestidad. Y la Iglesia debería tener como primera herramienta de acción la honestidad.
¿Tú crees que a los curas no les gustan las mujeres? Pues le encantan. Oye, pues son hombres, ¿no? ¿Por qué deciden ser célibes? Bueno, es una renuncia a... Pues su condición natural, pues es una condición sexual, evidentemente, no en el tema del celibato. O sea, yo no creo que haya un padre que no vea a una niña y diga, oye, qué mujer tan hermosa, por ejemplo, ¿no? Cualquiera que sea. Bueno, pero ¿por qué renuncian a esa sexualidad? Bueno, pues es una renuncia de donación en el amor a Dios.
Up. There we go. That has so much, right? It's got largely two conversations going on. And the film is following most closely the priest of the church or the pastor of the Church of Reconciliation, the one with the rainbows behind him, right, who speaks of love and marriage and commitment from his perspective. But we also very much get the official line, right, the official Roman Catholic line, which is, as they both state, one of the most dominant voices in Mexico. And this debate, right, happens not in public, right, unless something like, and there are definitely marches, there's gay pride, there's all sorts of stuff going on in Mexico, but the actual debate happens in the legislature, right? It happens in those places in the churches, as well as other places sort of away from the dominant voices of the media, which pronounce masculinity, right, a heteronormativity as the way, even as the state is a secular state. There's a very, very tenuous relationship between the legislature and the churches. In the history of, this is a much longer conversation, but in brief, the history of the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century is one of being separated from the state and not actually having, not always in practice, but for example, priests weren't allowed to vote under a lot of the laws, and the proclamation of it being a secular state in terms of its of the legislature has done things like legalize gay marriage, even in the face of it being not a popular decision by and large. So there's a relationship between state and people, and then also between different churches or people who want to contest, right, what the Roman Catholic Church has said is correct. And this happens constantly. Now, what also is behind this, right, is the hypocrisy that we're aware of. When you're in Mexico, you see it as well consistently, that what people say or do, let's say on Sunday, but as part of their religious life is not what they do behind closed doors, right? And that's true everywhere. That's not just Mexico by any stretch. But some of this, the hypocrisy that is mentioned comes from the history of the relationship of the Catholic Church, right, with the social order, and the fact that many, many, many Mexican people profess Catholicism, right, as their religion. In fact, most statistics say 90%. But when you look at, right, how they live their lives, it doesn't fit what the gentleman who represents the Roman Catholic Church in this prescribes, right? That is monogamy except for one marital partner, right? Again, not unique to Mexico, but the relationship between people and state and church and state, right, is a particular one for this scenario. And there's been a lot of backlash, in fact, just as recently as last month, against the legalization of gay marriage in Mexico, same-sex marriage, I should say, in Mexico. But it is at least on paper, the law of the land. And it's been a long, hard fight for those people in favor of it. And we'll see what happens. Now, I don't want to always focus on tension, so I want to show another representation here. I love some of these documentaries for just the way that they share stories, and I think you saw some of that in the last one. This one in particular as well, one of its strengths is that for the duration of the documentary, you get to know two very, I would say, very special, but at least very interesting people. So I'm going to just introduce you to them. And they don't translate the title, but it comes from the phrase, to die on your feet is better than to live on your knees. So morir de pie is to die standing up, basically.
¿Qué espero? Posiblemente sea demasiado utópico. Pero yo espero que el pueblo despierte. Con todos los cambios que ha habido a nivel mundial y con la famosa caída del muro, que el enfrentarnos a que el llamado socialista real y el llamado socialismo real ya no existe, me sigo manteniendo del lado izquierdo. El que hablaba de la creación del hombre nuevo, y el hombre nuevo todavía no existe. Hay nuevos hombres, pero el hombre nuevo no hay. Habrá 1, 2, 3. Cuando la muerte del Che, Fidel en la velada solemne que se hizo en memoria al Che, en el 67, me decía en un discurso algo así: nos preguntan ¿cómo queremos que se eduquen nuestros hijos? Queremos que se eduquen en el espíritu del Che. Si queremos saber cómo debe ser el revolucionario del futuro, queremos que sea como el Che. Creo que el 2000 es muy distinto a como yo lo soñaba cuando era niño, ¿no? Las naves volando, los coches electrónicos, la supertecnología al alcance de todo el mundo, y pues no están, ¿no? Entonces, la verdad es que la fórmula no sé todavía cuál sea, pero de que tiene que haber, tiene que haber.
Ya está más frío, entonces yo lo puedo poner aquí. Para que no se enfríe.
No.
¿No?
Todo junto.
Lo que pasa es que ahora, bueno, estaba pensando que ahora ya me coordino más para comer y para que comas tú. Antes me quedaba con 2 cubiertos y seguía comiendo y acaba de comer y ya no te daba. Y me decías, ¿ya acabaste? ¿Ya se te quitó el hambre? Te decía, ya te llenaste. Ya te llenaste. Porque yo seguía acá comiendo, y sí es cierto, y te dejaba de dar de comer porque yo ya me había llenado, entonces no podía coordinar. Y ahora ya lo domino más. Sí es cierto, ¿eh?
Pero a mí me daba mucha pena estar pidiendo.
Ay, no. No, era nada, es un problema de coordinación. Y ahora me como hasta tu comida. Entonces, yo creo que yo al principio, yo cuando te empezaba a apoyar así con la comida, yo sentía como enojo, pero yo misma creo que me estaba como protegiendo de sentir que en realidad lo que estaba sintiendo era dolor, ¿no? Porque el cambio sí ha sido muy radical, muy radical. Es que era una lucha como entre luchar por lo que yo misma me estaba pasando a mí, que me estaba sorprendiendo, que me estaba doliendo, que me estaba cambiando todo el panorama, y al mismo tiempo lo que le estaba pasando a Irina. Entonces era así como estar en varias cosas al mismo tiempo y darle como un espacio a cada cosa, pero creo que hubo un momento de mi vida en que yo acepté que Irina no iba a poder comer sola.
¿Me prestan una pistola?
Me prestó una pistola. Al principio darte de comer fue bien raro.
Y lo que pasa es que hay cosas que habíamos platicado hace mucho como de manera así de suposición, de un supuesto, de que yo no quería llegar a estas circunstancias de dependencia. No estaba preparada. No lo estoy. Me ha costado mucho.
Uy.
¿Y Katia? ¿Se rindió?
¿Dónde está? No, aquí no está Katia. Está riquísimo con el orégano, ¿no? ¿Tienes mucha hambre?
Ya hasta se me estaba yendo.
Ay, ¿cómo crees?
Nelly se casó conmigo. Nos casamos en Cuba. Llenas de un amor y de un romanticismo y enamoradas. Y al pasar el tiempo, los años, mi enfermedad comenzó a afectar otra vez. Y empezó a afectar cosas que no teníamos previstas, ni siquiera imaginadas o que los médicos hubieran puesto un pronóstico. Y comienzo a dejar de ver. Y empiezo a ver manchas amarillas que terminaron por impedirme la lectura. Y muchas otras cosas.
Yep, there we go. So this is a little longer clip. And I did that on purpose because I wanted you to just have a few moments to get to know these characters. And I say characters not with disrespect, but these people, as it is a documentary. And the first person that you see on camera is also the last person that you see on camera. So this documentary is an exploration of a marriage between a man and a woman that goes through tremendous changes throughout their marriage. But the commitment of Nelly to Irina is, while difficult, it's unquestioned in her mind that she stays. And actually is part of the, is one of the major impetuses for the transgender transformation and identity change with Irina. And this documentary is one that I saw, and it doesn't tell you at the beginning that these are the same two people. In fact, you just saw the moment where you're like, oh my gosh, they're the same person. Because it doesn't want to prejudice you against, right? Understanding where this journey has taken them and where it's going. And also there's a lot of other things going on, right? There's a relationship here between Cuba and Mexico that's very tight. And the revolutionary experiences in Cuba affected Mexico, and people in Mexico also had dreams of having a government that worked, right, for the people. And they, this couple got married in Cuba and had those dreams. And things have changed, right? So this is, again, like this, I chose this because it just takes a moment to look at really what are real people, right? The struggles they're going through. And I do think that it's important that we hear, right, these types of voices on our side of the border. But also these films, right, they're made to tell stories, to change people's ideas about things, right? To affect social change and understanding for people who are going through difficult circumstances, whether that is disability or whether that is, right, other identity, other identity issues that are who they are, and having the space to express that, right, in this type of relationship is actually rather unusual. It's not unheard of, but it is unusual. So I share that with you. Now, I will say that the younger generation, let's say, definitely younger than me, but the youth in Mexico are much more open about their sexuality and much more fluid with it, as the same way actually that we see in the United States, with gender binaries being broken down and more acceptance of sexual relationships, right, that are more fluid than maybe in the older generations. And this is a film. Julio Hernandez Cordon is actually Guatemalan Mexican, and he was born in the United States. So he has an interesting perspective to things. I think he made his first films in Guatemala. This is, though, a very, if I may say so, a very Mexican film. It's infused with Mexican themes and characters and spaces and people. And it's been recognized in Mexico as well as a national film and awarded as such. I don't have a clip from the film itself, but I have a nice trailer and you get the idea.
Espérate.
Pues sí, ¿cómo le vamos a hacer? La bola del thriller me va a traer $6,000 y le damos, ¿ok?
Aliento que nuestros padres llamaron futuro y que en realidad viene vestido de presente y no se siente, no es complaciente, es el único que se atreve a hacernos frente a un espejo a las 5 de la mañana, ojeras, golpes, rasgos de defensa. Vamos a reinar en los cielos y en una ventana rota.
Sani, gracias por tus ojos y tu mirar. Sani, gracias porque tú viniste a mí. Sani, no sabes el bien que me das tú. No esperaba llamar.
All right. There we go. So I think you can see from this that there's quite a different attitude, right, about sexuality. And in fact, the movie is about so many other things, right? That's just the core of the two boys' relationships. One of them even has a girlfriend. It does cause some jealousy, right, for one of them to have another partner than the other. There's the class distinction. One of the boys is middle class. The other one, his mom cleans the first boy's house. So there's a lot going on in the movie. And what I find interesting, like I said, is that what you might think from watching a trailer like that, right, is that the bisexuality, the homosexuality would be the issue, and it's really not. Other issues are that the boys, they end up getting involved in a blood there's an underground black market for blood in the film, and the boys end up involved in that. That becomes one of the issues. Their inability to kind of change their social circumstances, that's one of the issues. That one of them has more privilege, and when he gets in trouble, can actually come to the United States to escape what he's gotten involved in. Those are the issues. And those are things, right, that youth deal with on a day-to-day basis. And in this film, those types of issues are represented. I want to also, because I am going to get to where we can ask questions, and I'm keeping an eye on time, I'm going to switch things up quite a bit, because I want to throw this last one in here. Not everything in Mexico, right, is about sex or immigration. There's all sorts of other things going on. Or just family, you know, or death or disability. I've shown a lot of very serious issues. I'm going to show another serious issue, but this one is about water. Now, the history of Mexico City was that it was considered the Venice, right, of the ancient Americas. There were lakes and waterways, and the Aztecs who populated it, the Mexica, they were able to live on those. When the Spaniards came in, they went through a process of pumping out all the water, right, from what was a natural lake system, and it's caused a whole lot of problems since then. But this is also a trailer for the film H2OMX. It's a documentary about the water situation. I did it again.
La Ciudad de México sí fue fundada en el agua.
Ahí en la noche nos secuestraron y nos amenazaban con que si no les llevamos el agua, pues, nos iban a hacer algo.
El origen de la problemática pues es ese, que la ciudad está en lo que era un lago y donde el agua normalmente tiende a ir.
Ya llevamos un promedio de 30 a 35 años, o sea, sufriendo.
Hago 3 viajes cuando voy con el burro en la mañana.
No solo los restaurantes tenemos problemas, digo, todas las colonias, toda la colonia Condesa tiene problemas.
Informó que más de 1.450 viviendas fueron afectadas por las fuertes lluvias del domingo, que superaron la capacidad.
Año con año es la misma situación, todo lo perdemos.
El agua es importantísima para la Ciudad de México, porque el día que no haya agua, la ciudad fundada en el agua va a morir.
Del DF nos mandan caca y se las regresamos en alimentos.
Creo que todavía el canal huele mejor que todavía el agua que supuestamente es potable y sale.
Esperemos que no llueva más, porque ya nos dio miedo.
Okay, so just as one of the things to consider, there's a lot of environmental issues that filmmakers in Mexico are documenting as well, both directly and indirectly. Water is one of them. In Mexico City, if you saw the people with the barrels, right, like the truck comes up to places that don't have water and unloads water, and then people in the neighborhood have to go get it out of the barrels. There are systems, it explores some of the systems that people are using to capture rainwater when they can. And it also just explores where the water that even gets to the city is coming from, the aquifers and the dams and the systems that provide water for Mexico City, which has over 20 million people in it. And if you aren't familiar with La Condesa, one of the neighborhoods of Mexico City, it's one of the most affluent. It's one of the most famous for its restaurants. And so that little section about like in La Condesa, they're having trouble getting water speaks to that, it's not just the poor in Mexico City that are affected by this, right? It's everybody's issue who's affected by it. I also recently got to know some filmmakers who are working with indigenous communities in, and I wrote it down, the Calakmul Biosphere Reserve, which is one of the largest producers of oxygen for our part of the planet. And similar to this, those filmmakers are exploring what is happening to the environment, right? Like, did you see all the trash in one of the waterways? So that is trash, right? That's polluting the water system already. And the biosphere is also in danger, and not just from things that you might think it would be in danger from. So in this documentary, the water system is in danger for many, many reasons, including that people are polluting it and including that the rain, right, isn't always reliable. But it also touches on the fact that to get to water, you have to go into environmentally sensitive areas, including lands that are part of indigenous communities. Also with the biosphere, it's the same thing. Even the best intentions, for example, creating a wind farm, right, can have serious environmental consequences to fish, therefore fishermen as well, making a living, right, to birds. And a lot of the systems are sensitive. And so the solutions for water, the solutions for power, and those types of things are very much on the mind, not just of us in the United States, but in Mexico. So I'm just going to wrap up a couple things, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So why does this matter? I don't know if you noticed that H2OMX, it said like coming soon in theaters. Well, did you guys see it in the theaters? No. One of the issues that I look at is, these Mexico, right, social issues, understanding Mexico in its terms. How come that doesn't get into the United States, right? And this is a huge, huge question that many people spend a lot of time on. But if we're looking at nationalized concerns, right, it's always about a globalized world. We just saw two examples. We saw Guatemala in the US, right, and Mexico in the middle, and many stories there and people. But I want to remember as well that this isn't, right, this isn't an isolated scenario. I really like to think about intersectionality. So when I think about markets, right, in the marketplace, and I think about films, and I asked you, like, how many people saw H2OMX, and no one saw it because it wasn't in our theaters. How many foreign films are in our theaters? Not terribly many, right? We actually are kind of spoiled in Austin. We get more than many other cities in the United States, unless you're on the coast or in other big cities. But even so, right, when you go to the movie theater, your choices are limited to Hollywood blockbusters and the few foreign films that get let in, right? That can make money, that can be exploited or appropriated, right? And that extends to people. It extends towards, what we include in the national dialogue covers all of these things, market products and people. And I don't really see always a separation between the two. And I think about inclusion, right? Who and what belongs? Well, obviously they don't belong, right? I mean, that's the dialogue, or that's the dominant narrative. And I want to return, excuse me while I find this. I want to return on this to the brown tide rising really quickly, because I think that this is actually kind of the key to understanding. Like, I, spent some time with you, like looking at Mexico. I hope from Mexico you got some sense, right, of some of the voices that are there. But when we come back to the US side and we think about, well, why don't these films get in, and why are we having this conversation about immigrants? I want to return to the political statement that is consistently being made, and I hear it every day on the radio, actually, that classifies immigrants, even documented immigrants, as less valuable than citizens, right? That there's a clear distinction between the USA, and in this case, I'm talking about Mexico, right? So Mexican immigrants are always, right, pretty much classified as not citizens. And that means that they're less than in most discourses. And even for citizens, right? A citizen continues, I think, to be someone who speaks English as a primary language, right? And whatever your background, culturally assimilated into Anglo-American society, right? And someone who doesn't, I think we're getting better about this, I hope we're getting better about this, but someone who doesn't question, right, the racial hierarchy that we've established in this country and that this country was built on, okay? That's just the way it is, right? Citizens have rights and other people don't. And so everything's going to stem from that. And I don't think I think we do a disservice if we separate that from the flow of media, the flow of people, the flow of ideas, like what we think about other people. I don't think films are going to fix it, right? Like I don't think if I took these films to every single college campus, I don't think that would fix the problem. But I do think it's a good starting point. And I think, that if we have these conversations, if we can learn how to change some of this rhetoric and to understand more, right, across the border and in dialogue, we'd be on better footing. There's so much more I want to say, but I am so going to stop there because I do want to make sure that we have time for any comments or if there are questions that people have from this. I will open it up. And I think we have mics as well. So we have a question in the front. You can speak really loud, but I want to make sure other people hear you too. But
Are we going to go?
Okay.
Okay. Why did you choose to focus on Mexico specifically? What interested you?
like me personally?
Yes.
Sure. So I grew up in Lansing, Michigan. Not many people know this, but Lansing, Michigan is super diverse. And it's one of those cities that they do test marketing in because its kind of percentage of what types of people are there is similar to the national average. And I mention that simply because I grew up thinking that was pretty normal. I went to school with immigrants from Vietnam and from Puerto Rico and from Mexico and from Cuba and from Kenya. And I thought that was normal. It certainly was, and I'm thankful for the people around me who treated it that way. I first, was exposed to the Spanish language on Sesame Street, for real. And, Maria and Luis. And then I had a 6th grade teacher named Mrs. Lopez. And she was from Mexico. And we celebrated La Virgen de Guadalupe. And it was not something that was treated as abnormal. And in fact, she is the patron saint of the Americas. So it's not abnormal, right? If you think about it in that context. I grew up studying Spanish because I had friends who spoke Spanish and I thought it was cool. And I learned about it through them. I learned about their experiences from Puerto Rico. I learned about their experiences from Cuba. And I learned about them from Mexico. I moved to Arizona. I've never had a bigger culture shock in my life. Ever. Never. And I've traveled, a bit. Not extensively, but a bit. I was heartbroken, like literally heartbroken, to be standing on my soil, on U.S. soil, and watch people around me being treated so badly. And I committed to being a part of the Americas with my studies and with my work. And I hope that I'm doing that justice. So that's the story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, Ben. It was nice to be here. I enjoyed your talk. It was very nice. I just wanted to kind of inquire about, you say that we being the U.S., the country could benefit from, hearing some voices from across the border, perhaps to understand them better. Do you think that's a two-way street? Perhaps the people in Mexico, the people in Latin America could hear, a new narrative from the United States. With this new presidential administration, they might think, oh, they hate us, they hate Mexicans, and maybe they might hear a new perspective. Like, no, every country has the right to have a border, defend its border, and look after its citizens and not the citizens of another country. Do you think the people across the border from us, Mexico and other Latin American countries, could benefit from this experience that we just had right now?
I do, but I would also, I do. And I think that information should go both ways. But if we look at the presence of the United States, its media, like if I go to a movie theater in Mexico or I turn on the television in Mexico, I am inundated with U.S. media. So I'm not saying that they wouldn't benefit from learning more, but I'm saying that they have, You can watch all the shows that you flip on and watch on your television here in the US, you can watch in Mexico, not vice versa. And if you go to the multiplex, it's all Hollywood films. So, and it's our news and it's our, do you get what I'm saying? Like the media flow is so out.
Do you think it's kind of one-sided though? Maybe they could hear another side of it?
They absolutely could hear another side. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Well, your answer sort of preempted my question, but I was going to ask, in the last slide you talked about the lack of success for films like the ones you just showed in the United States, lack of exposure to films like that. And I was going to ask about the historically poor performance of these kind of films in Mexico compared to films from the United States, and what factors might have caused Mexican cinema, as you were saying, to be so inundated with American-made films.
Well, I mean, a lot of it is quite frankly money. In terms of the U.S. just having buying power, right, for the movie theaters and for the media. Now, Mexico does have, right, it has media and it has movie theaters and it does project Mexican films. There's a tenuous relationship, though, historically with Hollywood. Mexico has tried some things, like they had an incentive where every peso that you paid at the box office would go into the Mexican Film Fund, and that got blocked actually by the MPAA. So, like, the US MPAA was like, don't do that. It's more complicated than that, but there's a lot of reach, and there's also, you know, protectionist measures that a lot of countries will try to do to say X amount of screens should be devoted to national cinema. Hollywood also pushes back quite consistently against that. The other part of this story, if we take that part of it out, okay, is that economically, the viability of the Mexican film industry has gone like this. Right? So back in the golden age of Mexican cinema, right, like the 50s, give or take, actually Mexico was helped a lot by the United States, and there was a booming film industry. And then it's gone up and down, and the way that Mexican presidencies work is they change every 6 years. There's no second term. And the film industry has historically been completely dependent on the president down saying we're going to put private funds or public funds or figure that out, and that has caused a lot of structural weaknesses in the Mexican system. If your funding models change regularly, every 6 to 12 years usually, right, it can be hard for filmmakers to have sustained careers. It's only we're in 2017 now. In 2015 was the first time since the golden age of Mexican cinema that Mexico had 140 feature films produced, total. In the late 90s and early 2000s, it was more like 9 to 25 per year Mexican feature films produced. So just that, if we just think in terms of sheer numbers, right, you can't beat Hollywood cranking out a million bajillion films each year with your 25. Because what are the odds that all of those are good films? It's never all good films. So there's a lot going on there, but it is interesting to me that as we got right to the 2012, 13, 14, 15, where Mexico was and still is producing over 100 films a year, how many Mexican films do we see here? Well, we got Instructions Not Included, right, and a couple others. And actually, a film that Gael Garcia Bernal starred in opened in theaters around the U.S. this past weekend. But it's an exception, right? It's an exception to a rule of pretty much dominance by Hollywood product. And some of it is power, money, and some of it is just simply we got so much stuff that you can drown out the rest. Did I get to the core of it?
Sure.
Okay.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Hispanic made films have also performed very poorly in the United States among Hispanic audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, you talked a lot about a lot of structural factors and the flow of Hollywood versus the Mexican film industry. Do you think any of it could simply come down to a cultural orientation towards Hollywood films, or just audience choice?
Yeah, there certainly seems to be a proven cultural choice for Hollywood films. And I think it's been cultivated over the years, right, quite successfully. And even if we think about, because I didn't touch on some of the most popular films in Mexico, really, which are broad comedies, right? Whether they make it to the States or not, the top box office earners in Mexico of Mexican films are broad comedies usually. And the comedy doesn't translate that well usually. I think that's part of why those don't always make it to the U.S. But also, it just seems like when people are voting at the box office, U.S. Latinos, Mexicans, in the United States, and other Spanish-speaking or not, could be second, third generations not speaking Spanish, right? They've chosen consistently to see other films besides their national films, and it's been, frankly, for Mexican filmmakers, it's been something they've had to deal with. They've had to find other audiences besides, crossing the U.S. border for those in most cases. And they have, the film festival circuit does show a lot of these films in the U.S., not mainstream, but the festival circuit. And many of these actually that I showed did very well, as I mentioned, La Jaula de Oro, and actually A Separate Wind, Viento Aparte, did well on the festival circuits and internationally. And there's a lot of Mexican filmmakers who are known by name internationally, but not in the U.S., which I find interesting, unless they won the Oscars, which was That was great. That's great. I would love to see, not just for Mexico, I would love to see the Academy Awards actually be about the best films and not just a celebration of Hollywood. Personal thing, but that's what I would like to see. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi. I really liked all the examples that you showed in a variety of films over the past 5 years, and I was curious to know if you had any other recommendations of films that are coming out in 2017 or 2018 that are leaning towards more Mexican cinematography.
No, not off the top of my head, but I would be happy to get your contact information and stay in touch about that.
Also,
yeah.
are you a part of any projects film-wise?
I currently do not make films. I study films, and I also am the film festival director for a festival called Cine Las Americas. It's an international film festival that specializes in films from Spain, Portugal, Latin America, and indigenous films of the Americas. So that's in May. If you're interested in seeing films, along these lines, come see us. Yeah. So that's my background is in film promotion mostly. And also I worked for a while, to get back to the why Mexico question as well, I worked for a while in Mexico helping filmmakers get connected to international funds to make their films. I think it's important that there are more voices in cinema, and so that was something that I worked on as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Jean, how effective do you think these films are in changing attitudes and behaviors that might contribute to addressing these social issues?
Yeah, that was one of those things I didn't get to in I'm an optimist. And I'm also a realist, pragmatist. But my optimist side says, and I've seen this happen in small settings. We showed The Golden Dream, La Jaula de Oro, at the Violet Crown when it came out, and we brought an immigration lawyer. And the conversation in that room was amazing, and I do feel like for those 45 people, a few of them walked out of there a little bit changed in perspective about what is happening with Guatemalan and Mexican migration to the United States. I've also been in Mexico for some of the screenings of those social issue docs that I kind of started with. And they do change. I've seen people, at least express that it has changed their opinion about things. And I don't know who's acting on what. I don't know who's changing their voting or trying to convince someone else to change his or her political or other stance. But I don't know where else to start either than in these types of settings. And if I see those changes, then I am hopeful and optimistic that they can spread. I also am quite aware that the other is possible, right? That's how ideologies function, right? It's how messages get transmitted and shared. But I'm committed to this side of, of the conversation and helping people just see that there's more. There is more to this continent, right, than just the United States and our right to be on this land. There's a lot more people in the Americas. What else? Ready to wrap? I mean, I will take questions if there are, and I'm also happy to say thank you so much for being here and allowing me to share some of these people's stories and filmmakers' works with you this evening.